The proceeding will start shortly. 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 The proceeding will start shortly.
Order, order. That's a bit loud. Before we begin, can I encourage members to wear masks when they're not speaking? This is in line with the current government guidance and that of the House of Commons Commission. Please also give each other and members of staff space when seated and when entering and leaving the room. Elliot Colburn to move the motion.
Thank you, Mr Hosey, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And can I thank all honourable and right honourable members for expressing an interest in this afternoon's Petitions Committee debate. I beg to move that this House has considered E-petition 300105, entitled Introduce Mandatory Ethnicity Pay Gap Reporting. If I could begin with a prayer of this petition, which states, and I quote, "Much like the existing mandatory requirements for employers with 250 or more employees must publish their gender pay gap, we call upon the government to introduce the ethnicity pay gap reporting, to shine a light on race and ethnic-based inequality in the workplace so that they can be addressed. Currently, there is a lack of available data engaging the ethnicity pay gap in the workplace. Introducing these measures will allow employers to be held accountable in closing the gap where there is a disparity. In order to achieve a fairer workplace, publishing this data is one of the next steps to knowing how extensive the issues are from a race and ethnicity perspective and not just through the lens of gender." This petition closed with 130,567 signatures, including 355 from my own Carshalton and Wallington constituency. And in advance of today's debate, I would like to thank the petition creator for taking the time to talk to me about why they started this petition, but also organisations like NatWest, Lloyds and Barclays, who took the time to speak to me about their experience of ethnicity pay gap reporting in their own organisations, and I'll go on to talk about this a little bit later. I would also like to thank the independent statistician Nigel Marriott for his very helpful briefing note and his thoughts, which members can view on his website. Now, Mr Hosey, there has been many calls in support of an ethnicity pay gap reporting, and this request is not something new or born out of this petition. It's been around for some time. And even the April 2021 Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities also found that pay gap reporting is a potentially useful tool. But if we go back to 2018, when my right honourable friend, the member for Maidenhead, was Prime Minister, she launched a consultation on this issue. And the stated aim of the consultation at that time was with the aim of helping employers identify barriers and enable a fairer and more diverse workplace, a move at the time that was welcomed by both the CBI and the Equality and Human Rights Commission, along with businesses, charities, academics and beyond. Now, all of these, including the petition creator and those who briefed me prior to today's debate, made the case that ethnicity pay gap reporting, much like gender pay gap reporting, could help businesses understand their workforce better, identify barriers to equality and create action plans to tackle those barriers. And of course it would help inform government as to the reality of pay gaps and consider the action they can take if needed. Now, I'm sure colleagues from across the House will go into greater detail about the benefits of pay gap reporting throughout their contributions, so I won't steal everyone's material in my opening speech. But I would just like to draw attention to an example of an existing system of pay gap reporting in the UK, which of course relates to gender. In a blog published by the LSE in March this year, it was found that gender pay gap reporting has indeed been effective in its aim of narrowing the gap. The difference between men and women's pay has shrunk by just under a fifth during this time, and it has affected employers due to the fact, according to the blog, that female workers show a strong aversion to employers that have high pay gap reporting, suggesting that organisations have felt compelled to make changes in order to attract and retrain workers. So one would hope that this would be the same in the case of ethnicity pay gaps. And indeed, speaking to some of these organisations, such as the three large banks that I mentioned in my opening remarks, it is very clear from talking to them that this has taught their businesses a lot, and it has helped inform their action plans to create more equal workplaces. However, as the government did identify in their response to this petition, it is true that there are some complications to this reporting that will need to be overcome before proposals can be brought forward. Now, these have been explained, very ably explained by Nigel Marriott in his briefing note, and I do just want to touch on a few of them here. And I must stress that these are not arguments against ethnicity pay gap reporting, but just an identification of what the government will have to consider before bringing forward any proposals. The first thing to mention is that whilst it might seem easy to go straight to gender pay gap reporting as the kind of the word I'm looking for, Mr Hosey, is template. This template that I'm looking for, thank you very much for being patient with me, for ethnicity pay gap reporting. It's not just as simple as being able to replicate that for a number of reasons. Now, gender pay gap reporting is supported by the fact that it's largely binary, although not exclusively, but given how big that discussion is, I think we'll save that for another day. And it's more or less evenly distributed across the country, whereas ethnicity breakdown in the population can alter drastically depending on where you are and can fall into a much larger number of categories. And this then presents a number of data protection issues because, of course, data of this kind must never reveal inadvertently the identity of the person that it's supposed to be reporting about. So, for example, a small business in a predominantly white community could inadvertently be revealing information about employees' pay when for just one of their employees, for example. And then there is the difficulty of how you disaggregate this data in the first place, i.e. what categories or descriptions do you use, and how do you truly reflect your employees' wishes and how they prefer to be identified. Finally, this is made all the more difficult when you consider the issue of disclosure, where it's estimated something between 5% and 40% of employees do not disclose their ethnicity. Now, again, these are not arguments against ethnicity pay gap reporting. It's just important to raise them here and consider how we overcome them in order to bring forward proposals. It may be that we look only to businesses over a certain number of employees, or report on an industry level rather than an individual employer level, for example. But if I could perhaps suggest to the Minister, as he and I are both London MPs, I would suggest that London is the perfect place to trial such a scheme before rolling it out countrywide. Either way, I do hope that the government is considering this carefully. I note from their written response that they are looking to publish their analysis of the 2018 consultation later this year. So any further information as to the date of that publication and any plans to bring forward such proposals would be very welcome indeed. But I will end my remarks there, Mr Hosey, and hand over to the rest of my colleagues.
The question is, this House has considered E-petition 300105 relating to ethnicity pay gap reporting. Stephen Bonner.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, Mr Hosey, and it's also a pleasure to follow the member for Kilshalton and Warrington. It saddens me to say that structural racism still pervades and permeates our society today. Over decades, progress has been too slow in addressing racial inequalities. We are continuing to see the impacts of this and inequality in the jobs market, particularly towards those groups from minority communities. It should shame all of us to know that ethnic minorities in the UK are less likely to find career-type sustainable work than their white counterparts, even when born and educated right here in the very same United Kingdom. While we know that ethnic discrimination in hiring is pervasive and enduring, it is not clear just how much of the labour market disadvantage experienced by ethnic minorities can be attributed to employer discrimination. Overall, just 2/3 of black, Asian, minority ethnic people are in work in the UK, which equates to 68%, compared with nearly 4/5 or 78% of their white counterparts. Once fortunate enough to be in work, black, Asian and minority ethnic people are also more likely to be in lower paid employment than their white counterparts. This, in large, reflects long-standing occupational segregation and often intersects with other characteristics such as gender and class. People from minority ethnic groups are overrepresented in a range of lower-paying jobs such as care workers, security, hospitality, customer services and taxi drivers. Racial inequality in the labour market has persisted for decades. We all must play a part in addressing it, especially those of us in government, and this government can do more. For an example of the employment inequality divide, we need to look no further than right here in this city of London, where data gathered by the ONS shows that the minority ethnic employees in the capital earn 24% less than their white counterparts. 24% less, Mr Chairman, a quite shocking statistic in the 21st century in which we are to believe we live in an equal society. This is a statistic which will not only continue to increase without swift action by this government. We must introduce a mandatory reporting requirement modelled on the 2017 Gender Pay Disclosure. This will be one of the most transformative steps a company can take to address racial inequality at work and to overcome practical difficulties in the workplace. We have a government with a very large majority that has indicated the desire of, quote, building a fairer economy, ensuring the UK's organisations reflect the nation's diversity and equality. Why then, I must ask, has it taken so painfully long for this government to consolidate a report that has been commissioned since 2018, more than 2 years after it released its consultations on the plans? No further developments have materialised. In Scotland, on the other hand, we have made great progress. In March 2020, a commitment was given by the Scottish Government to implement the key findings of the Scottish Parliament's Equalities and Human Rights Committee. And in doing so, the Scottish Government will take responsibility to assess the prevalence of institutional racism and proactively challenge and change practices that disadvantage minority ethnic communities and, more importantly, ensure these communities are involved in shaping this change. The Scottish Government, of course, recognise that taking these recommendations by no way represents a final step, Mr Chair, but it is a step in the right direction, and it is a step more than has been taken by this UK Government, and it's a step more than they seem willing to take. Pressure is now increasing on the Government, and an agenda for change had already been set out in 2018 by the independent McGregor-Smith Review on Race Relations in the Workplace. The report showed a lack of access to training and promotion opportunities for black and ethnic minority employees. It also showed low numbers of top-paid black and minority ethnic employees and high proportions of black and minority ethnic people in poorly paid jobs. Currently, there is a lack of data available to us to gauge the ethnicity pay gap in the workplace. Introducing these measures will allow employers to be held accountable in closing the gap where there is disparity. To achieve a fairer workplace, I wish of us all, publishing this data is one of the next steps to know how extensive the issues are from a race and ethnicity perspective, and not just through the lens of gender. The Prime Minister has already faced criticism for saying, and I quote, "What I want to do as Prime Minister changes the narrative so we stop the sense of victimisation and discrimination." Well, perhaps if he had paid attention to the tragic and brutal killings of George Floyd, which led to widespread outrage and protests across the globe, he would realise governments are now facing more pressure, increased pressure, to remove societal injustice faced by blacks, Asians, minority ethnic communities. Just like I advocated back here in October of last year on the issue of gender pay gap reporting, I am now asking again the same of this Government to deliver what they have already promised in their 2017 manifesto and implement compulsory ethnicity pay monitoring. Thank you, Chair.
Caroline Noakes.
Thank you, Mr Hosey, and it is a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And I would like to add my congratulations to my honourable friend, the member for Coshalton and Wallington, for having led this debate today. It's a really important issue, and I stand here in a somewhat privileged position as chair of the Women and Equalities Select Committee, because I have the opportunity to talk on a regular basis with those who are seeking to champion the rights of people with protected characteristics across the country. And the thing that really strikes me, and I can remember going back to when I was very newly in post, a fantastic meeting that I had with a group of black female entrepreneurs. And it was the first thing that they said to me: we must have pay gap reporting. We must have it mandatory. And there was a very good reason for why they wanted it to be mandatory. They had spoken to over 100 FTSE companies who all wanted to report, but were nervous about how. Were nervous about the metrics that they should use and whether their ethnicity pay gap reporting would be comparing like with other comparable organisations. Which is why they said to me, we need you to put pressure on government, because actually, unless it is mandatory, it will not happen in a coherent way. It won't happen in a way against which companies can be measured. I do, of course, give way.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for giving way, and she's making some excellent points. Would she agree with me that there is, as well as an obvious equality imperative for this measure, a really strong business imperative, as she has just set out, and that government would do well to acknowledge that?
Well, I absolutely agree with the Honourable Lady, and we heard from my honourable friend, the member for Carshalton and Wallington, who was talking about some of the leading banks who already do this, but wish to see other organisations do more. And I was really pleased earlier this year to have an email from Zurich, one of the country's biggest insurers and the first insurance company to introduce ethnicity pay gap reporting. And they made the point, and there are good reasons why this is complicated. There are not good reasons why we should not do it, but there are reasons why it's very complex. And one of those issues is about size of business. Well, with gender pay gap reporting, that's dealt with by only making the larger companies report. I would argue exactly the same should be instituted for ethnicity pay gap reporting. Only make larger companies do it. And my honourable friend is right to point out that we don't want individual employees to be identifiable, so we need to find a way to do it on an aggregated basis so that those employees don't have their own personal salary details revealed. But just because something is difficult, just because it's complicated, does not mean that you should not do it. And the thing that always strikes me about gender pay gap reporting is, look, we know it has shone a light. And as a result of that light being shone, you have gradually, inch by inch, sorry, should I say centimetre by centimetre? It's all very topical at the moment. Seen that pay gap reduce. Not as far as I would like to see it. I'd like to see it at zero. But we know there are also challenges around intersectionality. And I always say that. If you're a woman in this world in the 21st century, you're still stuffed. If you're a disabled person, or, heaven forfend, a disabled woman, you have additional challenges. But if you're a black woman, you have more challenges. And it's time that we're absolutely honest about that and say, OK, so we need data. And I think the honourable gentleman from the SNP made the point that this needs to be data-driven, but data needs to be absolutely granular. We need to have massive amounts of detail so we can see which groups are being the most adversely affected. Because guess what? Until you have identified that accurately, you cannot put in place measures which will help them the most and give them the equity that we all want. So I think the honourable gentleman from the SNP absolutely highlighted something that my select committee looked at over the course of the COVID pandemic when we were looking at the way BAME people were impacted by the pandemic. And what we saw from the evidence given was that they were disproportionately represented in, I'm going to describe them as public-facing roles, so whether it was the care sector, whether it was in transport, whether it was in our NHS, they were having to interact with people on a daily basis, putting them at more risk. But what do we also know about some of those roles, particularly care and transport, is that they are very poorly paid and that in some of those roles are very insecure. So we know that intersectionality is something we absolutely have to scrutinise and scrutinise closely. Now, I've made the point to my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, before she was the Foreign Secretary, in her capacity as Minister for Women and Equalities, that this is something that ethnicity pay gap reporting is something that companies are crying out for. They want it to happen, but they want it to happen on a mandatory basis. So until such time as the government is prepared to legislate, and I do think that we could have an employment bill come forward. I look to my honourable friend the Minister and hope that he will give us some detail as to whether we might expect an employment bill this session, despite the fact it being missing from the Queen's speech. But that strikes me as being an absolutely ideal opportunity to bring forward some legislation around ethnicity pay gap reporting that we are all calling out for. I absolutely recognise that there are challenges for small business when it comes to additional requirements from government. I'm not going to describe this as a burden because I don't think this is a burden. This is something that will enable them to look more closely at their own employment practices, to look at those leading organisations that have said, look, we're going to do this regardless of the lack of a framework. They'd prefer it if there was a framework, but I think it's an opportunity for us to look forward and to drive down some of those basic structural inequalities that we still see in our country. So I look forward to the Minister saying something very positive in his wind-up.
Fiona House.
Thank you, Mr. Hosey. It is a pleasure to speak in this debate while you are in the chair, and I want to congratulate the petitioners for bringing this important issue of ethnicity pay gaps into this chamber so we can have a good debate about it. And I have listened very carefully, and everybody has made already some thoughtful contributions. Yes, it is not easy, but I would say all of us here are in politics, and I would include the Minister. We are in politics not to do the easy thing, but to put our minds to the more difficult stuff. Anybody can do the easy things. So I hope, too, that we hear some positive reply from the Minister. Mr. Hosey, Saturday marked the UN's International Equal Pay Day. Here in the UK, women make 87 pence for every pound earned by men. I mention the gender pay gap because all too often the gaps within the gap are overlooked. We must recognise how financial inequalities disproportionately affect some women within our society, including LGBT+ women and women with disabilities. And the honourable member, the chair of the Equality Select Committee, has already mentioned the word intersectionality, where one disadvantage plus another disadvantage then increases the problems people face. And while women in the UK earn 12.5% less than men, ethnic minority women earn an average of 2.1 less than white women. We must ensure that women from all parts of our society are included in our efforts to close the pay gap. I mention the gender pay gap because we have seen the effectiveness of mandatory gender pay gap reporting. And again, I echo the words of the Honourable Lady about the importance of making it mandatory. It's a mandatory bit that we need. There are, of course, some companies who are already doing it voluntary, but the real need here is for it to become mandatory. I'm proud of the Liberal Democrats' role in introducing that legislation back in 2015, and our first female leader who fought so hard to get it on the agenda in her time as a business secretary. Before that legislation was introduced, only 6 companies published their pay gap data under the voluntary initiative. There is no doubt that the policy has driven greater transparency and accelerated progress towards workplace equality. In contrast, statistics show that the ethnicity pay gap has not significantly improved over that time, with recent reports suggesting that ethnic minority workers have been worst hit by job cuts during the pandemic. There could be no more pressing time for action now. The McGregor-Smith report, which has also been already mentioned, identifies a lack of transparency in corporate Britain as a key barrier to progress. Without data, how can employers identify the disparities without their own companies? How can they make informed decisions that will improve their recruitment, promotion and management policies? Research shows that most employers believe that ensuring workplace diversity is a priority, but little more than a third actually collect and analyse data to identify differences in pay and progression for employers from different ethnic groups. The voluntary approach has driven, at best, slow and inconsistent progress. Currently, only 13 FTSE 100 companies currently report their ethnicity data publicly. Government action is needed if we are serious about tackling the pay gap, its causes and its effects. As with gender pay gap reporting, there is a clear case for introducing mandatory ethnicity pay gap reporting, and I ask the government to set out a timetable for getting this into law. Equality monitoring of the workforce is also an essential step to carrying out ethnicity pay gap reporting. I ask the Minister, when will the government introduce legislation to ensure that all listed companies and business employing more than 50 people publish workplace data broken down by race and pay band? And I have listened very carefully to also the difficulties. But hey, let's tackle that, because what the end result is will be so much more positive for employers and for the businesses themselves. It has been 4 years since the McGregor-Smith review, 4 years since the government committed in its manifesto to asking large employers to publish information on their ethnicity pay gaps. 3 years since the government launched a consultation on ethnicity pay gap reporting. We are all still waiting for the results of that consultation. The government, Mr. Hosey, must stop dragging its feet. Only once businesses begin to publicly report the diversity of their workforce will we see the start of real change. As with the Black Lives Matter movement showed, action is needed now to build a more inclusive, more equal society. Addressing race equality at all levels in the workplace can no longer be optional. Thank you.
Kirsten Oswald.
Thank you, Mr. Hosey. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship, and I'm grateful to the petitioners for allowing us to have this debate today. As someone with a background in human resource management, I fully support the introduction of ethnic pay gap reporting as part of the measures that we need to tackle pay discrimination. Transparency is essential when we expect organisations to deliver a particular outcome, and the Chartered Management Institute confirmed that 80% of the managers they surveyed agree on the need for mandatory ethnicity pay gap reporting for large organisations. 50 years of sustained effort to deliver gender pay equality demonstrates the importance of transparency. In 1970, the Equal Pay Act decreed that men and women in the same employment doing equal work must receive the same pay. In 1993, the Pay Equity Project highlighted women's earnings remain significantly lower than male colleagues due to factors such as undervaluing occupations with a largely female workforce and the effects of women's generally greater caring responsibilities. These were reinforced by institutionalised discrimination, such as by Glasgow City Council, which, after a decade-long battle by women workers and a change in administration, paid out over £500 million in compensation. Other factors will drive the ethnicity pay gap. even if direct discrimination is addressed. These can only be properly understood if the data is captured and analysed. Just recently, the Office for National Statistics reported that in some circumstances, among recently recruited full-time employees, women may now be paid more than men. But of course, across the whole workforce and the employment cycle, women's earnings remain below those of male counterparts, and we have some way to go. But despite that, the forces of reaction pounced. The Bright Blue Group, which is backed by the new Secretary of State for, I'm not sure of the department's name, it used to be Housing, Communities and Local Governments, and others say that the policy job is done on gender pay and we should now leave it to business. But like other things said by supporters of this government, it's far from the case. The call for inaction in the face of continued inequality is all too predictable. In fact, the lesson to learn from half a century of pursuing gender pay equality is how enduring entrenched inequality can be. And we can also see the variety of tools and arguments deployed by those who defend the status quo, or as with this government, who wish to drag us back to an earlier age. I was disappointed but not surprised to see the findings on ethnicity pay reporting from the Cabinet Office's hand-picked Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities. The Commission hid behind data complexity to make recommendations only for organisations who choose to publish figures. So if you think you're doing well, tell us. If you're doing badly, you can keep that quiet. And that finding, which the government has seized on, stands in stark contrast to the meticulous work and recommendations of Lady McGregor-Smith, one of the few women of colour to head a FTSE 100 company. She got it bang on when she said, "Until we know where we stand and how we're performing today, it's impossible to define and deliver real progress." She's been backed by Peter Cheese, the Chief Executive of the CIPD, who said, "We know that gender pay gap reporting has driven greater transparency and accelerated progress, and we believe the same is needed for ethnicity pay gap reporting." That's why the government's delay on this issue, including its failure to publish the responses to its 2019 consultation, is so disappointing. And the combination of Brexit and the pandemic have massively disrupted the world of work, and there's more to come, including a likely spate of redundancies with the end of furlough. And research by the IPPR shows that ethnicity has been a major factor in the adverse economic impact of the pandemic. But unless we act now, it may also be a hidden factor in the distribution of rewards during the recovery and beyond. We know already that many who were on the front line during the pandemic were among the lowest paid. And ministers have bandied the word hero about a lot, but at the same time, they presided over the creation of a multi-tiered employment market where many more people stand to lose their status and rights as employees and be treated as freelancers choosing to work fewer hours. Others are simply underemployed and at the beck and call of 0 hours paymasters. This multi-tiered workers' rights policy is being used as an argument for the labour market being too complex for ethnicity pay gap reporting to be effective. How convenient. Of course, if the government brought forward their persistently delayed employment bill, they could sweep away some of these anomalies and return to workers the rights enjoyed by previous generations. They won't, of course, because in addition to returning us to imperial measurements, ministers also want to see workers' rights in large swathes of the economy revert to the 19th century. Instead of standing in line waiting to be picked for a day's work, workers are now anxiously waiting for an email or a text to tell them if they have a shift. And even before the pandemic, the CBI, the TUC, the Equality and Human Rights Commission were calling for ethnicity pay gap reporting to help us better understand and address pay inequality. Even the Investment Association recognises the benefits of mandatory ethnicity pay gap reporting as a means of helping businesses demonstrate that they're generating sustainable long-term value. They also identify the lack of transparency as a barrier to change, highlighting that only 27% of FTSE 100 companies even publish the ethnic diversity of their board. And that reinforces Lady McGregor-Smith's comments on the lack of information available to her inquiry from FTSE 100 companies, and should really end any pretence that significant progress can be made on a voluntary basis. If we are to tackle the ethnicity pay gap, we need to do so from the root cause of much of the gap, which is continued discrimination. The UK Government needs to take a leaf from the book of Zara Mohammed, the General Secretary of the Muslim Council of Britain, who has a laser focus on employment inequality. or the team led by Peter Hopkins of Newcastle University, who examined the experiences and perceptions of young Muslims in Scotland, some from my constituency. And while most young people from black and minority ethnic communities were proud of their Scottish identity, that report left no doubt about the extra challenges they face, including in the workplace. Or perhaps the Young Women Lead Committee, supported by the Scottish Parliament, which examined the transition from education to employment of young ethnic minority women. These are some of the voices that we need to hear on this issue, but we also need to see action, and the difficulty is that many of the powers to act on this issue are not held in Scotland, but they are held here in Westminster. The Scottish Government is doing what it can to provide leadership, in stark contrast to the inaction we see from this UK Government. They are going to extend the requirement for Scotland's public authorities to publish gender pay gap information to include disability and ethnicity reporting, and to ensure their equal pay statement covers these issues. They're also developing an ethnicity pay gap strategy, supporting employers in Scotland to evidence how different communities are represented in an organisation across different pay bands. And they will soon launch an immediate priorities plan, setting out actions to tackle structural disadvantages faced by BAME communities to act as a foundation for a long-term anti-racism programme. While these are welcome actions, I will draw to a close, Mr Hosey, by repeating the words of Lady McGregor-Smith. Until we know where we stand and how we are performing today, it is impossible to define and deliver real progress. And that is why we need the UK Government to step up to the plate, to deliver mandatory ethnicity pay gap reporting, and to do so with the maximum possible coverage. Either that, or they should get out of the way and pass the powers to the Scottish Government and let them make progress on delivering the fairer Scotland that we know is possible.
Pongasali.
It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship, Mr Hosey. Can I begin by thanking the Petitions Committee for making the time for this important debate, and the Honourable Member for Carshalton and Wellington for introducing this debate. I also like to thank the organisers of this petition. As the Honourable Member mentioned, 130,000 people signed it, including 470 people from my constituency. I also like to thank all the Honourable Members that contributed to this debate. The Honourable Member for Coatbridge, Kristen and Bilshall, hope I got that right, talked about structural racism and the impact it has, particularly on society. The Honourable Member for Romsey and Southampton North talked about how unless the reporting was made mandatory, it won't really happen. And talked about the work she's done on the Select Committee on how BAME individuals have been affected during the pandemic, which shows that there are issues in terms of inequalities. And also the Honourable Member for Bath talked about the effectiveness of mandatory reporting, gender pay gap reporting, and how that's made a significant difference. The last 18 months have brought a welcome focus on issues of race and ethnicity in this country and around the world. This is something that I'm also particularly passionate about. And what we've seen, particularly in the context of the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, and also the rise in the Black Lives Matter protests, we've seen this petition take off. I mention this because ethnicity pay disparities don't exist in isolation. It does exist within broader structures of racism that affect Black and Asian minority people in every part of their lives. I've experienced it myself. I've previously called for the government to implement a race equality strategy and an action plan covering areas such as education, health and employment, because I really do feel that this would really address the structural inequalities that exist. I do believe that, at the centre of this, there must be action to tackle discrimination in the workplace and unequal access to training, finance and opportunities at the ethnicity pay gap. And this brings me to talk specifically about this petition. This petition calls for introduction of mandatory ethnicity gap pay reporting. And as the Minister will know, this is not a new suggestion or a new demand. This is something that has been called on for some time. And I'll be very keen to hear from the Minister what proposals the government has to kind of address this. And as the Honourable Member mentioned earlier, the 2018 McGregor-Smith review into workplace said that the government must legislate to make large businesses publish their ethnicity data by salary band to show progress. We all know that the government launched a consultation on this issue, which ran from October 2018 until January 2019. But I'm extremely concerned that we've yet to see anything published on this or any response to this consultation literally 2 years later. And I just really want to know from the Minister, what kind of message does that send to black and ethnic minority people in this country? To me, it comes across that the government doesn't particularly care about these individuals. The consultation has been done, but nothing has really kind of materialised from this. I also want to talk about the issues that have been identified with mandatory reporting and how they can be overcome. I do feel that the delay is not about practicalities of introducing mandatory reporting, but instead I do feel the government has gone cold on this particular idea, and I do hope that the prolonged delay on this this issue simply won't go away, and that we can't settle for voluntary reporting. And I hope the Minister hears loud and clear that voluntary reporting is totally inadequate. Just this week, and I'll tell you why, just this week it was reported that only 13 of the largest 100 employers in this country have published their ethnicity pay gaps. This is similar to what the Honourable Member mentioned about before mandatory pay gap reporting was introduced in 2017. Prior to it becoming mandatory, a voluntary initiative led to only 6 companies publishing the gender pay gap data. Yet consultation shows that employees were generally supportive of mandatory reporting because it meant that organisations would essentially have consistent methods and be able to benchmark against each other. In this case too, only mandatory ethnicity pay reporting will really deliver meaningful data from a wide range of businesses. And this echoes conversations mentioned by some of the honourable members about the fact that we need to get the data. I do believe that businesses themselves, a lot of businesses do back mandatory reporting from conversations that have been had. CBI has joined the TUC and the Quality and Human Rights Commission to call on the government to go beyond the recommendation of the Commission on the race and disparities and bring in mandatory reporting without delay. Be happy to.
Thank you. My honourable friend will be aware that without introducing mandatory ethnicity pay gap reporting, we don't truly know the full scale of the problem. We know that at the moment, I think people are saying it's about 2.3% in terms of a gap. But when you actually look at individual groups within ethnicities, you've got 16% for Pakistani groups and 8% for black groups. So does she agree that until this is made mandatory, not only will we not know the scale of the problem, but companies will not take steps forward to address these inequalities?
I completely agree with the comments that my honourable friend has mentioned. Unless we get mandatory reporting, we won't really know what the full scale of this issue is. And this has been shown by the fact that, voluntary organisations, given the opportunity to do the reporting, very little organisations have taken it up. And actually, it leads me to talk about, I was going to discuss later on, about the stats, which have already been kind of collated, which is quite alarming. But we do need to have this done mandatory to be able to address the issues that are there in terms of addressing the inequalities that exist. I also wanted to point out that, the Commission has stated, I wanted to address the report that the Commission, the Human Rights Commission mentioned, which only call for voluntary reporting and some of the practical issues that the government have highlighted. The Commission stated that many employees around the country simply do not have enough ethnic minorities for recording sample to be valid, and this is something that I've heard in this debate. But there are leading experts in these fields, including the Chartered Management Institute and the Chartered Institute of Personal Development, who have actually set out practical ways to overcome this. Other concerns, such as the legal basis for collecting ethnicity information or low declaration rates, can simply be overcome through clear guidance from government. These practical issues are what the government have been working on over the last 2 years, so that their information is there for us to be able to do this rather than kicking this issue into the long grass. I also want to end by saying about why ethnicity pay gap reporting is so important. We know that at a national level there are significant disparities exist between people of different ethnicities, as my honourable friend has mentioned. In 2019, the ONS found that the median hourly pay for white people was £12.49. For black people, it was £11.50, while for people of Pakistani origin, it was just £10.55. The ONS study also found that people of Chinese origin earned an average of £15.38 an hour, and people of Indian origin earned £14.43. This really should be caution to us about making sweeping statements about ethnic minorities as a whole. But there are clear evidence that people's race and ethnic backgrounds determines how much they earn, and I've seen this firsthand. And sadly, for many people, the colour of your skin, along with gender and class, does determine the opportunities that are open for you. And that is something that we really need to change. And I also want to mention the interaction between race and other characteristics of gender. There was a recent report done by the Fawcett Society that found that ethnic minority women are most invisible from positions of power across public and private sectors in the UK. You know, we see it. We see it around us. We know that the range of connected factors do determine pay disparities such as age, location, and of course gender and race. And it's precisely for this reason we need to build up more data on these disparities, as my honourable friend Frasressa mentioned. Company-specific reporting is so important because it disobliges employees to examine their data and to work on why disparities might exist. It doesn't assume that discrimination takes place, but rather provides information so that employees can make informed decisions to improve recruitment, promotion and pay policies. Without it, we're not going to be able to see what progress has already been made and where there is more to do. To conclude, Mr. Hosey, to fight discrimination, you must first see it and understand it. And I have to say the government has dragged its feet on this issue far too long. The consensus for mandatory ethnicity pay reporting is broad, and the arguments for this are compelling. So when the Minister does stand up, I'd be grateful if you could tell us what the government would do to bring forward legislation to implement this vital measure. Thank you.
Paul Scully.
Thank you, Mr. Hosey, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. First of all, I'd like to congratulate my honourable friend, the member for Carshalton and Wallington, and the Petitions Committee for securing this debate today on a really important issue. I'm sure that we can all agree that it's been an interesting and informative debate, and I'm really grateful for everyone who has contributed. Now, my honourable friend has done an excellent job opening up this debate, as one would expect from him and also from a member of the Petitions Committee. As Mr. Hosey may know, I sat on the Petitions Committee for a number of years, and I know from personal experience how important and valuable its work is. But what my honourable friend did is he set out in a really, he set the scene in a very balanced and comprehensive way, and he also demonstrated the complexity around the issue as well, showing that it's not simply a binary issue. There's a lot of the concerns and possibly unintended consequences, which I'll explore in a second, that we need to put into the mix to make sure that we can get our consideration of this subject really right. But petitions, in terms of the issue, petitions are a great way to ensure that we don't overlook issues, and that we do concern, both as Parliament and in government and in my department, consider the matters of most concern to the people that we represent. And today's debate is no exception to that. The petition was signed by over 130,000 people. That's a testament to the interest in ethnicity pay reporting as a means of achieving a fair workplace. There were 322 people in my own constituency of Sutton and Cheam. And I know that the Petitions Committee, the many people who signed the petition, I understand the petitioner, the instigator is here today, and the MPs who spoke today and others are really concerned that the government is yet to publish its response to the 2019 consultation on mandatory ethnicity pay reporting. Now, clearly, the last 18 months haven't been as any of us were expecting, but I want to just quickly set out the journey that we're on in regard to ethnicity pay reporting, give some background and some of the issues that we're juggling with as we consider how best to take things forward. Firstly, I should be absolutely clear that the government is committed to building back better from the pandemic and building back fairer in doing so. People from all backgrounds must have the opportunity to achieve their potential. And a key part of building a fair economy is to ensure that our businesses and other organisations reflect the nation's diversity from factory floor to boardroom. That's central to levelling up our ambitions. We know that we face challenges in ensuring equal access and fair representation of people from minority ethnic backgrounds in the workplace. We know that we need to do so much better. While they're improving, employment rates for ethnic minorities continue to be lower than they are for white people. Once in work, the evidence shows that people from ethnic minorities progress less far and earn less money than their white counterparts. But the picture is complex, and outcomes vary substantially between ethnicities and by gender within ethnic groups. For instance, over 2 in 5 Pakistani or Bangladeshi workers are in the 3 lowest skilled occupations, but Indian people are the most likely of any ethnic group to work in the highest skilled occupations and have the highest average hourly pay. Now, I set out the journey that we're on. In 2016, as has been mentioned, the government asked Baroness Ruby McGregor-Smith to examine the barriers faced by people from ethnic minorities in the workplace and consider what we might do to address them. One of her recommendations was that the government should legislate for mandatory reporting of ethnicity pay data by 20,000 pay band. The government response said that it was persuaded by the case for reporting. Baroness Ruby McGregor-Smith's report highlighted that equal participation and progression across ethnicities could be worth an additional £24 billion annually to the UK economy, but that we expected businesses to take the lead in taking reporting voluntarily. So the government commissioned a 1-year-on report in 2018. Disappointingly, this showed that limited progress had been made. Just 11% of employees reported that their organisations collected data on ethnicity pay. Given that, in 2018, we consulted on mandatory pay reporting. The consultation sought views on the benefits of monitoring and publishing ethnicity data, what might be reported, what contextual information should be provided, narrative and action plans, and ethnicity data classifications. The consultation responses raised a series of issues. Establishing a standard ethnicity pay reporting framework is considerably more challenging than was the case even for gender pay gap reporting. There are genuine difficulties in designing a methodology that provides accurate figures and one that allows for interpretation and meaningful actions for employers, employees and the wider public. Let me just give you one example now. You would expect, I think, the business department to be leading from the front in all things workers' rights and in business. And let me read from the government website when it talks about civil service pay. Of civil servants whose ethnicity was known, Asian and white staff had the lowest average annual pay, that's $27,200, followed by black staff, $28,400, staff with Chinese ethnicity, $29,500, and staff from the mixed ethnic group, $29,600, with staff from the other ethnic group having the highest, $30,000. Problem is, the average median annual pay for all civil service was £27,100, £100 lower. Now, any basic grasp of statistics would say that's not possible to have every ethnic group that's recorded above the average median pay for the entire civil service. Why is that? That's because 22% of the civil service did not identify. So that's clearly skewing the figures. And this is one of the just anomalies, the unintended consequences. It's not something that we can't get around, but it's just illustrative of statistics, how statistics can be misread and misdiagnose the problem. I'll happily give away.
I think it's interesting to note that Zurich commented that 87% of their workforce had identified which ethnicity they were from. So why is Bayes doing so much worse than a private sector company?
Well, this is the civil service as a whole. This is all things as a whole. But what I'm saying to my right honourable friend is that actually the figures here are clearly skewed by that 22%. So if we want to get accurate reporting, because as I say, everybody, according to this, is above the average median pay. Now, that can't be the case. That's not average. So therefore, the figures are being skewed. One can't diagnose the problem from this set of figures. So therefore, it's working through those figures, working through a methodology that we need to actually make sure that we have robust figures. Yeah, I'll give way.
I'm interested in what you're saying. Can you clarify, is the government therefore working through that methodology? What specifically are they doing, and when do they expect to have a system in place which does take account of the complexity which we all acknowledge, but which absolutely must not get in the way of us making progress?
I'm grateful for the Honourable Lady for letting me progress with the speech, because that's exactly where I was going to come to. We've continued to work with businesses and other organisations to better understand those complexities identified through the consultation. More recently, we've been working with the business in the community and race work charter members. My honourable friend talked about people crying out and businesses crying out for reporting. The charter members are currently stand at 700. That's up from 300 this time last year. So there's clearly a big push there of people signing up to the charter. One of the points in that charter is to collect data on ethnicity and the pay gap. So this work has particularly looked at action planning and what participating organisations believe to be the key drivers of the ethnicity pay gap: the culture and leadership, recruitment, retention and progression. Now, in parallel, earlier this year, the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities published its report setting out a roadmap to racial fairness in the UK. The report makes an important contribution to both the national conversation about race and the government's efforts to level up and unite the whole country. In its report, the Commission points to the statistical and data issues that can affect ethnicity pay reporting and suggests a voluntary approach. It further recommends that all employers that choose to publish their ethnicity pay figures should also publish a diagnosis and action plan. That should lay out the reasons for and the strategy to improve any disparities. The Commission further recommended that pay data should be disaggregated by different ethnicities to provide the best information possible to facilitate change, and that account should also be taken of small sample sizes in particular regions and smaller organisations. To support employers undertaking this exercise, the Commission recommended that the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy is tasked with producing a guidance for employers to draw on. I'll happily give way.
Thank you, Mr Hosey, and I would like to thank the Minister for giving way. I think the information the Minister has provided is very helpful, particularly in terms of what work business in the community has done, and also quoting the Commissioner for Racial Equality. It would be grateful if the Minister could just clarify to me exactly what the government has done since they have done their survey consultation in October 2018, because I'm hearing about what organisations have been working on, which is fantastic, but I'd really like to hear from what the government has been working on to address this issue. Thank you.
The Honourable Lady, and the government is working clearly towards this, and I'll continue developing that journey in my speech. What we do want to do, we do want to make sure that we are delivering on something that is possible. What I don't want to do is what the Leader of the Opposition did last week by talking about setting a £10 minimum wage, and then this week advertising for stewards for the Labour Party conference paying £9.75 an hour. What we've got to do, politics is the art of the possible. We've got to make sure that we can actually get this absolutely right. So to diagnose the problem correctly and to solve the problem correctly. Now, the Honourable Member, I will give way.
Thank you. I would like to thank the Minister for giving way. I'm still not very clear what the government has been doing since October 2018. I would be grateful if you could clarify and set out what the government has been doing since 2018 to address this issue.
As I said at the beginning of my response, I'm developing that journey and covering that last 2 years' worth of work if you'll remain patient. The Honourable Member for Coatbridge, Cryston and Bells Hill talked about racism and clearly we need to make sure that we tackle racism in all its forms. but the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities found that most of the disparities in this instance, when tackling ethnicity pay differences and disparities, what they examined, they do not believe that they have their origins in racism. There are other factors that may be at play. For example, as I said, geography, class, sex, age. But whatever the cause of the pay gap, clearly it's essential that we do get organisations to tackle this. Yeah.
Thank you for giving way. The Honourable Gentleman said this issue is not about racism, and he's also conceded in his remarks that actually the data that is being received is not very clear because a number of people, different groups, are not actually reporting. So how can he be so sure that the issue is not racism when the small amount of data that he does have show that there's a difference between ethnic pay gap, ethnic people and their white counterparts in terms of pay?
I think what the Honourable Lady has mixed up two things, because what I talked about, the data that I talked about was specifically civil service data, and it was just specifically to make the point that actually you can read different things out of statistics. What I was quoting about racism is not my view necessarily, it's the view of the CRED report from the Commission that was specifically tasked to look at this and other issues. But we are committed to take action on ethnicity pay reporting, but we want to make sure that we're doing the right things which will genuinely help to move things forward. Key to that is determining what it makes sense to report on and what use the data may be put to. It's far from straightforward. The Commission's report that I refer to and our post-consultation work with businesses and other organisations identify a wide range of technical and data challenges that ethnicity pay reporting brings. Firstly, statistical robustness. In 2019, the Royal Statistical Society argued for a minimum sample size per category of at least 100 in order to draw valid conclusions. The purpose of this was to ensure that the calculation of a pay gap statistic would be reasonably reliable when interpreted by a non-statistician. They would not likely be able to appreciate or measure the extent to which the statistic is affected by random chance. Secondly, as we've heard by my friend, the member for Carshot and Wallington, anonymity. It should never be possible to identify any individual from ethnicity pay gap analysis. This means a sample size has to be large enough so that it's not possible to link a number of individuals of the same ethnicity to a particular pay band. Thirdly, data collection and business burdens. A survey of more than 100 organisations by PwC in August 2020 found that almost 35% didn't currently collect any ethnicity data, with half identifying legal and GDPR requirements as a barrier to collecting the data. Amongst those organisations that did collect data, around half said that it would be unable to publish their ethnicity pay data due to poor or insufficient data driven by low response rates. Fourthly, reporting on a binary basis. One way to mitigate low employee declaration rates is to combine all individuals from an ethnic minority background into a single group for reporting purposes. But such an approach risks masking the significant variations, as has been discussed, in labour markets outcomes between groups, and therefore the relevance of any action plan. And finally, skewed results. Reporting at more granular level risks results being skewed by particularly large or small pay values because of low numbers with particular ethnic groups. If an employer with 300 people employs black individuals in the same proportion as the wider population, 3% of the England and Wales working population is black, according to the Office of National Statistics, then their average pay would be calculated from just 9 individuals, and that assumes 100% declaration rates. The uneven geographical distribution of specific ethnic groups complicates the issues further. In Wales, only 0.7% of the working age population is black. It's much harder, therefore, to produce reliable and actionable statistics from relatively few data points. Now, all this creates complex challenges when deciding how best to take forward ethnicity pay reporting. But government's determined to take steps to help employers tackle race and ethnic disparities in the workplace. I think we'd all agree that the key to this is obtaining a good understanding of the issues that may be driving these disparities, and most importantly, developing meaningful action plans based on that understanding. The Ruby McGregor-Smith report, the government's consultation on ethnicity pay reporting, and the Commission's work all make an important contribution to both the national conversation about race and the government's efforts to level up and unite the whole country. The Government is now considering what we've learnt from that ethnicity pay consultation and our further work and the Commission's report in detail. We're assessing the next steps for future government policy, and we will set out our response in due course. I should just like to end by once again thanking those who have contributed to the debate today. It's been a valuable discussion. Thank you, Mr Hosey.
Elliot Colburn, brief wind-up.
Half an hour, Mr Hosey, but you'll be relieved to know that I won't take it.
I'll be the judge of that.
Mr Hosey, can I begin by thanking all honourable and right honourable members for their contributions to this Petitions Committee debate this afternoon, and indeed again thank the petitioners for allowing us the opportunity to discuss this important topic in the House this afternoon. And I think the key theme taken from a lot of members' contributions today has been that sense of the importance of data, the importance of getting good data and creating evidence-based policy as a result of it. That's absolutely what we want to see, because of course skin colour should not be a predeterminant to pay, and that's what we all want to see tackled in this country. So I do look forward to hearing more from the department as the hopefully brief time goes on as to their response to the consultation and the next steps. I'm sure the petitioners will as well. But can I, on that basis, Mr Hosey, beg to move?
The question is, this House has considered E-petition 300105 relating to ethnicity pay gap reporting. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Of the contrary, no. Order. The sitting is suspended until 6 p.m.